Thank you very much, Conor. Again, at the risk of boring you again, I say, look at the paper. It is most helpful. It sets out the law as it is, and then it sets out discussion points. And there's a lot of food for thought. There was a lot of food for thought in the presentation, and there's a lot of food for thought in the paper. So now we're moving on to session 4, and you're going to hear from Mark Brennock, who is Director of Public Affairs at Murray, which I've mentioned earlier. He was formerly a journalist with the Irish Times, and he's now with that consultancy firm. And he's very knowledgeable in the matter of how referendums are conducted, because he's been communication advisors to the various referendum commissions since 2008. So that's 10 years. That's right. So, Mark.
Okay, yes, thank you very much.
Enlighten us.
Thank you. I think the reason I was asked to speak today is as the judge has said, as the chair has said, that I have some experience of how the regulation of media affects how referendum campaigns are conducted, and in particular how the media behaves during those campaigns. I was a journalist for more than 20 years, and I spent most of the time in the Irish Times. I did a count last week, and I was involved in covering 14 separate referendums. And then on the other side, I left journalism for the world of public relations and public affairs 11 years ago. And I've been the project manager of the Public Information Campaign for 7 referendum commissions, covering 10 different referendum proposals. So I've seen it from both sides, I suppose. And the questions I want to look at today is firstly, the role the media has in communicating during a referendum campaign, how the media is regulated, how it affects journalists, how the requirement for balance and fairness and impartiality, which Conor spoke about, how that's implemented in practical terms by the media, whether the Commission does have a role in taking on claims made by one side or other during a campaign, and how they should do that, and whether the regulation that does apply to broadcasters should apply to other media as well. That's a question to be looked at. Firstly, on the role of the media, referendum commissions, like election campaigns, are fought very substantially through the media. These are shots all from the last referendum campaign on same-sex marriage and some of the players in it. Sure, people get the referendum commission leaflet in their door. They get leaflets from the yes and no side. They meet canvassers. But very substantially, the information people get during a campaign is from the media, and generally, it's from what is called the traditional media. I mean television, radio, print media. There is a lot of talk about the role social media has, the growing role that in the same-sex marriage referendum in particular, it was very lively, it was very busy. That's true, but on social media, people tend to follow people they agree with in the first place. Just because people are following it and are engaging it and are clicking the like button on Facebook doesn't mean they're engaged in serious political debate. The media with influence still tends to be the traditional media rather than social media. So just looking at the traditional media, there was a Reuters Institute report a few months ago showing that in Ireland last year, 2/3 of people said they still got their news from television, 46% got it from radio, 40% from newspapers. 2/3 did also get news online, but they tended to get them from the traditional online sources. In other words, the online websites of RTE, of the Irish Times, of the Irish Independent, of the Examiner. They're not new sites, they're still the traditional old media brands. So they are still hugely influential, and it is the broadcasters in particular that if, for example, and the reality is if RTE in particular decides that a particular aspect is important, it has huge influence on what the rest of the media do. So the regulation that we have, the legal regulation, does apply to broadcast journalists rather than to print journalists. It's that legal requirement to have balanced coverage. That the rules then have been interpreted by the broadcasters as very much a meaning they have to give 50-50 coverage to each side. Now, let me just find where I am here. So newspapers can decide to campaign strongly on one side or another in a referendum. We saw that very dramatically in the Brexit referendum in the UK last year, where newspapers could simply take one side and publish information from one side, and that's perfectly fine. There's no regulation to prevent them from doing it. And we can talk later about the arguments of whether that's right or wrong. But just to look at the current rules and regulations and how they impact on the media. In the past, broadcasters have often felt an obligation to seek out people on one side of a campaign. So if all the voices in a campaign are on one side of a referendum, people have nevertheless felt they have to seek out people on the other side to balance that. And if they can't find them, often there hasn't been coverage of the issue at all, and people can show up in a polling booth for a referendum and be given a ballot paper, say if there are 2 referendums taking place on the one day, to be given a ballot paper for one referendum about which they have heard very little. The good news is that the 50-50 requirement that media imagines that it has, or some broadcast media imagines it has, isn't really the case. The 50-50 requirement, as Conor said, is restricted to free-to-air broadcasts, that if broadcasters are giving time to the yes campaign and the no campaign to make a case, they must allocate them on a 50-50 basis to give them free, uncontested airtime. But there's much more room for flexibility in the interpretation of the fairness and balance rule, I think, than has been used. That the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland issued guidelines for broadcasters before the 2015 marriage referendum, and I see in this morning's paper they issued new guidelines again yesterday, which have reinforced this point. That they say, yes, you must be objective, impartial and fair in broadcast media, and that's the case anyway, whether there's a referendum or whatever. But they said there is no requirement to allocate an absolute equality of airtime to each side. They said you can achieve fairness, objectivity and impartiality through the selection of contributors, through the amount of airtime given to each side, through the scope of the debate that you have, through how the presenter handles the topic. So they also urge broadcasters to focus on the issue to be decided in any referendum rather than just to measure the amount of coverage given to each side. So the journalists themselves can do programmes on the factual situation behind a referendum rather than simply giving time over to people to argue black and white against each other. So there is more room for flexibility, according to the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, than has been interpreted by some broadcasters. Presenters have to seem neutral. The gentleman on the left, well known to most of you, that's his normal non-neutral look. He tends to take a particular approach to broadcasting. And there he is on the right before one of the referendum campaigns, making it clear that he's taking a neutral position. The requirement for neutrality is problematic when you consider the typical style of political interview we're used to hearing. The typical type of broadcast interview these days tends to be quite confrontational. Oh, look. You might want to plug in your PC.
Oh, that's happening.
Is it not plugged in?
It mustn't be. It is, I think. There we go.
Okay, so questions in broadcast interviews you tend not to sound like things like, "Good morning, Minister, would you like to tell me about the plan that you have?" They tend to be much more saying, "Come on, Minister, this plan isn't going to work, this is crazy." And that's the style that we are used to in this country and in many other countries. But in circumstances where the interviewer is very concerned about the need to seem neutral, then he or she is less likely to be confrontational. And critics do say that this means that the advocates of the yes and no side are given their allotted time to make their case. If they want to make outlandish claims or slightly far-fetched claims, they tend to be allowed to do that without being challenged in the way they would if there wasn't a referendum taking place. And I'm going to take a really silly example just to try and make the point. So in the normal course of events, someone who goes on air to declare the earth is round is allowed to say that without being challenged. But someone who wants to go on and assert that the earth is in fact flat will get a more robust approach. There's the flat earth, by the way. So they could come along and produce this. The interviewer is likely to say, "Come off it, that's a fake photograph. That's actually what the earth looks like," to challenge them. They're asked, how come if the earth's flat, ships don't fall off all the time? All of that. If there was a referendum on the shape of the earth, broadcast interviews might feel like holding back. They're supposed to show respect to each side. They're supposed to be neutral. If someone wants to go on and say the earth looks like that, say, "Oh, really? Tell me more about that." The question is whether during a referendum campaign, this is what you want to happen. I found this slide I thought was particularly entertaining. That if somebody wanted to go on and make a case that actually the earth is shaped like that the interviewer couldn't say, "For God's sake," the way Vincent Brown does, would have to say, "Really, would you like to explain that to me?" To take a more realistic example, I've been around for a number of the referendums on European Union treaties. In every referendum on a European Union treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, the Nice Treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, somebody on the no side has come on and say, "If we vote for this treaty, there will be conscription into a European army." And it's been said every time, still hasn't happened. But every time they got on, people said, really, tell me more about that. Similarly, the other side said, if we don't vote for this, foreign direct investment in Ireland is going to dry up, multinationals are going to flee the country, and it will become an economic wasteland. And they're allowed to say that. Now, if those things were said outside a referendum context, they would be challenged probably an awful lot more than they are during a campaign because of the requirement for neutrality and the requirement for the 50-50 side. Again, the good news is that the guidelines from the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, again, which were published again yesterday, say that you don't have to be quite as deferential, perhaps as media sometimes is, that you are allowed to critically examine the views of referendum interests campaigning for a particular outcome, and that just because you challenge them doesn't mean you're being unfair, or doesn't mean you're not being impartial. Where am I now? So yeah, I'm going to come on to the role of the Referendum Commission, which is the other part of what I'm talking about. I've managed the public information campaign for the Referendum Commission for each of the last 7 campaigns, 10 different referendum proposals. On each occasion, media have contacted us during the campaign to ask would the Commission adjudicate on whether claims be made by one side or the other are factual or not. So firstly, let's just look at what the legal role is, and Conor has talked about this. The Commission is to prepare one or more statements containing a general explanation of the subject matter of the referendum proposals. That's quite limited, to prepare one or more statements. The question is, does that mean they can also get stuck into a campaign when people are saying things that aren't true and saying, hang on a minute, that's not true? There has been argument over whether the Commission is allowed to do that or not. They're to publish and distribute their statements, and they're to encourage people to vote. So when people do say the Referendum Commission isn't active enough during a campaign, doesn't get stuck in, doesn't argue with one side or other, you have to bear in mind that's what the law says. It's chaired by a judge who takes the law rather seriously, and there are 4 senior office holders of state on the Commission. So, they have to look and think carefully, are they allowed to do this? So when I've been running the campaigns, on each occasion, media have contacted us a lot to ask us to clarify issues. The Commission isn't set up as some kind of highly activist referee jumping into the debate, exploding myths and so on, but it has evolved over the past 10 years in its interaction with the media. Each Commission has a chairperson appointed. That person is either a sitting judge of the High Court or a retired judge of the Supreme Court. The interviews, the chairman has done more and more media interviews as time has gone by. In the past, the chair of the Commission did very few media interviews. They're out quite a lot during campaigns now. They allow the Commission to explain the referendum proposal in general, to answer questions about claims that are being put forward during the campaign. The Commission doesn't answer questions on a particular issue without thought. Each issue of significance is considered by the full Commission with the assistance of legal service. The Commission uses a substantial amount of airtime on all national and local television and radio stations to broadcast brief explanations of the referendum proposals. The law changed some years ago that no longer is free-to-air time given to the yes and no side. It's all given to the Referendum Commission now to give a neutral explanation of what the proposal is about. So the Commission has grown steadily into being a valuable source of public guidance during campaigns. My own experience is that people tend to believe the Commission, which is a rare achievement for any public body in these days of growing scepticism about all official sources of information. During and after a number of recent campaigns, the Commission has been subject to judicial review proceedings a number of times by individuals unhappy with what the Commission has said. And so far, none of those proceedings have ever been successful, but it's a very uncomfortable position for a referendum commission to be in, to have people going to court asking the High Court to declare that something the Commission said wasn't true or wasn't accurate. So, there are reasons why it is cautious about stepping into the debate when it does. But the media does tend to give more and more prominence to what the Commission says in the course of the campaign. And I think that's a healthy thing. A number of changes have been proposed. I'll touch on them briefly because Conor mentioned them. A number of past commissions have said they haven't been given enough time to perform their functions. Some have been happy with the time. And there's also the point, should the commission functions, could they have permanent existence within an electoral commission? There's been a proposal around some time for an electoral commission. It was recommended by the Constitutional Convention in 2013. The proposal was that commission might work on encouraging voter registration, might take on the functions of the Standards and Public Office Commission, and it could also take on the functions of the Referendum Commission, and past commissions have supported that. Now, there's an issue of whether regulation should apply to other media as well. And firstly, there is no legal requirement for balance and fairness. That does give newspaper owners significant power to influence the outcome, and they're often seen as being a very small group of well-off media owners, and it gives them disproportionate influence. The other argument is that it is dangerous to have the state and perhaps the government of the day regulating the output of the media. That the typical argument for freedom of the press says a newspaper should have the right to argue for whichever side it chooses. That while there's an argument that broadcasters are in many cases funded by the state and in all cases regulated by the state, and therefore they should be neutral and be seen to be neutral, there is an anomaly around privately owned broadcasters. Are they not in the same position as privately owned newspapers, and regulation applies to the privately owned broadcasters, doesn't apply to the privately owned newspapers. So I'm not taking a view on that one way or the other, but it might be an interesting issue worth considering. This is a point of the media landscape. I can go past it really. It's a reference to a point I made earlier about how despite the huge changes in the media, you see there that television and radio and printed newspapers still have huge influence. So some points just to raise for you at the end, that firstly, the requirement for balance and fairness and impartiality applies to broadcasters and not newspapers, and we might want to look at that. Broadcasting does remain the most influential outlet, and broadcasting is the one which is regulated. So despite the rise of online and social media sources, radio and TV do remain hugely influential. The Broadcasting Authority of Ireland has made clear, as I was saying earlier, in its guidelines that balance doesn't mean a slavish adherence to a 50-50 rule during a campaign. And that the guidelines do seem to offer more flexibility to journalists, but there is still an understandable culture of caution among journalists that if you are going to go out and make a programme yourself about a particular referendum without having a stopwatch giving a 50-50 split between both sides, you are open to being challenged and accused of being unfair. And that's a very difficult position for journalists and editors to find themselves in, which is why I think some of them and some of my former colleagues do find the 50-50 rule somewhat comfortable, because it does protect you from being accused of being unfair. And finally, the point about the Referendum Commission. Currently, it intervenes in referendum. It publishes its account of the referendum. It intervenes in the debate in a fairly controlled way, and there is obviously an issue to be considered about how much or how little it should be allowed and told to intervene. So that's, I think, conclusion where I am. One more thing: the proposals for consideration on giving the Commission's functions to an electoral commission, and whether we should give more time to the Commission to perform its functions. Again, just to speak from practical terms, from being involved in the Commission, sometimes the amount of time given to prepare a guide for the campaign, to check it legally, to discuss it at great length, and then to have it printed between when the legislation is passed and when the referendum takes place is hugely challenging. And every time there is a fear that the Commission might get something wrong. So far, I haven't seen it ever get anything wrong, but it really is a difficult position for a Commission to be in, and the time factor is very important. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Loads of food for thought. Is that not the case? I just wanted, lest I forget it, I just want to make 2 points. In the submission we got from the Broadcasting Association of Ireland, it's from Michael O'Keefe. He has the guidelines annexed, the guidelines which were in place when we got the submission, which I think was in December. The guidelines are annexed to the submission, and there's a lot of information in that submission, and it's on the website. So all of that material is on the website. In addition, the Secretariat did a summary of recommendations made by the referendum commissions over the last 10 years maybe, and that's on the website as well. So we've put a lot of material up there that you can access, and I just wanted to remind you of that. So now we're going to go on, into a private session to consider all the food for thought we have been given, and we'll go public again at 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock we're going to run this session up to lunchtime, and we'll go public again at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.